Nile Davenport was a name that carried weight, an empire built from the ground up, a fortune amassed through relentless ambition, and a reputation solidified as one of the most cunning business magnates of his time. Now 72, Nile had officially retired 5 years ago, handing the reins of Davenport Global to his only son, Porter. Yet Nile was far from a silent observer. Though the title of CEO no longer belonged to him, his influence lingered like a shadow over the boardroom. With sharp, silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes that could size up a person in seconds, Nile was an imposing figure. Even in retirement, his days were filled with private meetings, discreet investments, and the occasional intervention when he deemed his son's decisions too reckless. He claimed to have stepped back, but everyone knew that when Nile spoke, the world listened. 38-year-old Porter Davenport had spent his entire life preparing to follow in his father's footsteps. Educated at Ivy League institutions and groomed to lead from an early age, Porter took over Davenport Global with the promise of modernizing the empire. While his father ruled with an iron fist, Porter preferred calculated strategy, believing that power wasn't just about control, but about vision. Handsome, with chiseled features and a wardrobe of tailor-made suits, Porter exuded confidence, yet those who knew him best understood the weight he carried. Living in his father's shadow had forced him to be twice as good, twice as ruthless. But as much as he resented Nile's interference, deep down, he feared failing the legacy he was meant to uphold. Bailey Cannon had never been part of high society. At 34, she had spent the last 8 years as a registered nurse at Northern General Hospital, dedicated to saving lives in the way that mattered most to her. With warm brown eyes, a gentle smile, and a resilience that came from years of dealing with high-pressure medical situations, Bailey was the kind of woman people trusted. She had no connection to the Davenport dynasty until now. Fate had a way of pulling unexpected strings, and soon she would find herself tangled in their world, a world of power, deception, and secrets she never asked to uncover. The winter night was brutal. A howling wind cut through the streets of the city, rattling streetlights and sending flurries of snow swirling like ghostly figures beneath them. The temperature had plummeted to below freezing, leaving the roads slick and treacherous. Nile Davenport, dressed in an expensive black wool coat, stepped out of the grand ballroom of the Windsor Club, where he had spent the evening mingling with New York's elite. His driver had the night off, his own decision, as Nile prided himself on his independence. As he walked to his sleek black Mercedes, the cold bit at his skin. He climbed into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and the powerful engine purred to life. The heated leather seats did little to warm the eerie feeling in his chest as he pulled out onto the road. The city was quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind and the crunch of snow beneath his tires. Then, it happened. Rounding a sharp curve near the bridge, his tires hit an invisible patch of black ice. In an instant, control slipped through his fingers. The steering wheel jerked violently, and the rear of the car swung out as if possessed by an unseen force. The sound of screeching tires echoed in the night, followed by the gut-wrenching slam of metal against concrete as the Mercedes careened into a guardrail. Glass shattered, the front crumpled, and Nile's body was thrown violently against the airbag before everything faded into blackness. Northern General Hospital was a whirlwind of activity when Nile arrived. The trauma team worked quickly, rushing him through the emergency doors, his unconscious body barely clinging to life. Severe head trauma, broken ribs, internal bleeding, the prognosis was grim. He was stabilized just enough to be moved to the intensive care unit, where a team of specialized nurses, including Bailey Cannon, took over his care. Bailey had seen families react in all sorts of ways in moments like these: panic, grief, shock. But Porter Davenport was different. When he stormed into the ICU, his presence was as commanding as his father's. He was livid. "This is unacceptable," he snapped, his piercing eyes narrowing at the medical staff. "My father is a billionaire, and this is the best you can do. Where is the chief of surgery? I want an update now." Bailey stepped forward, maintaining her professionalism. Mr. Davenport, I understand you're upset, but we are doing everything possible for your father. Porter turned to her, his jaw clenched. Are you? Because I see a man who built an empire lying here, and I don't see urgency. Bailey took a slow breath. She had been in this profession long enough to know that fear often masked itself as anger. I promise you, he is receiving the best care. Her voice was calm but firm. Porter stared at her for a long moment before exhaling sharply, raking a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. Just make sure he lives. Bailey nodded, knowing this was only the beginning. Porter wasted no time in ensuring that his father received the best medical attention money could buy. Specialists were flown in, consultations were held, and the hospital was given explicit instructions. Nile Davenport was to be given top priority care. Yet, despite the world-class treatment, the updates Porter received were the same. Minimal progress, no signs of improvement, and no guarantee of when, if ever, his father would wake up. Days passed and frustration mounted. The hospital staff had grown wary of Porter Davenport, avoiding his sharp tongue and impossible demands. He had turned his father's private hospital suite into an extension of an ICU, filling it with a team of the best professionals. Yet none could provide him with the answer he so desperately sought. Bailey Cannon, however, refused to be one of those who cowered before his rage. She had just finished covering an extra shift on another floor due to short staffing when she entered Nile's private hospital room. The space was sterile, yet filled with state-of-the-art equipment, a stark contrast to the warmth of a typical patient room. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of Porter's commanding voice echoed through the space. I want an update, and I want it now, Porter barked, his frustration reaching a boiling point. Where are the doctors? What am I paying you people for? The nurses and staff kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact, hoping not to become the target of his wrath. Bailey, however, had seen enough. She stepped forward, her voice firm but steady. Mr. Davenport, lower your voice. Porter turned sharply, his eyes darkening as he took in the petite yet unwavering nurse standing before him. Excuse me, he scoffed. You think you have the right to tell me what to do? Stay in your place. Bailey felt the sting of his condescension, but she refused to back down. I am in my place, right here, taking care of your father while you scream at the people trying to save his life. Porter's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You have no idea who you're talking to. No, Mr. Davenport, Bailey shot back, taking a step closer. You have no idea who you're talking to. Belittling the staff will not heal your father. You need to leave and come back when you've calmed down. The entire room fell silent. The air between them was charged. No one had ever spoken to Porter Davenport like this, and the disbelief was evident in his expression. His anger simmered, his sharp gaze narrowing on Bailey. You're fired, he said coldly. Bailey crossed her arms. You can do that, but it won't change a thing. I know my worth, and I know my skills. I can find another job, but replacing doctors and nurses won't miraculously heal your father. The truth is, it might be weeks or months before he even responds, and no amount of yelling will speed up that process. Porter was stunned. No one had ever dared to challenge him like this. He had been raised in a world where his word was law, where people feared his power. But Bailey Cannon? She wasn't afraid of him. His jaw tightened. Get out, he snapped. But his voice lacked its usual force. Bailey stood her ground for a moment longer, letting him feel the weight of her words, before turning on her heel and walking out, leaving Porter standing there, chest rising and falling with anger, frustration, and something else he couldn't quite place. Bailey had expected repercussions after standing up to Porter Davenport, but what happened next was unexpected. The hospital administration, knowing her value, didn't want to lose her. Instead of termination, they quietly transferred her to another facility across town. It was a blessing in disguise. Her new location was closer to home, and she could finally work without the constant storm that was Porter's rage. Meanwhile, Porter's unchecked temper continued to wreak havoc at Northern General. Nurses and staff began refusing to work on Nile Davenport's floor, unwilling to endure his relentless tirades. Even the most seasoned professionals found his temperament unbearable. With the hospital facing a staff shortage due to his behavior, Porter resorted to hiring private nurses. But word spread quickly. His reputation had preceded him, and no qualified healthcare professional wanted to take the job. Those who did only lasted a few days before walking out, unable to deal with his impossible demands. A month passed, and Nile's condition remained unchanged. Porter, for the first time in his life, felt powerless. His father lay in that hospital bed, unmoving, and there was nothing he could do to change it. His frustration wasn't just with the staff, it was with himself. Then, fate intervened. Bailey had almost forgotten about Porter when they crossed paths again on a crisp Friday evening. She was at Grayson's Bistro, a cozy spot near the hospital, having dinner with a few coworkers. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, filled with soft jazz music and the clinking of glasses. She was mid-laugh when she felt an imposing presence beside her table. Porter Davenport, dressed in a navy blue cashmere coat, his face unreadable. He stood stiffly, his sharp gaze locked onto her. The lively chatter at her table faded as her colleagues noticed who had just interrupted their dinner. "Bailey," Porter said, his voice lower than usual, almost hesitant. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Mr. Davenport." He exhaled sharply, glancing at the curious eyes around the table. "Can we speak privately?" Bailey sighed, placing her napkin down. She could feel the questioning looks from her coworkers, but curiosity got the better of her. She stood up, leading him toward a quieter corner of the restaurant. They stood in silence for a moment. Then, taking a deep breath, Porter finally spoke. "I was out of line." The words seemed foreign in his mouth. "I owe you an apology." Bailey folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Go on." He cleared his throat, looking visibly uncomfortable. "I've been struggling to find qualified healthcare professionals. No one wants to work with me." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I wonder why." Bailey arched an eyebrow. "You think?" Porter sighed. "I've never been good with people. Business? Sure. Negotiations? Absolutely. But emotions?" He shook his head. "That's something I was never taught." Bailey studied him carefully. There was something different about him now. Less arrogance, more vulnerability. "You think just saying that makes up for everything?" she asked. "No," Porter admitted. "But I need help, and I don't know where else to turn." He hesitated before adding. Bailey scoffed. "You want me to come back, after the way you treated me?" "I know I don't deserve it," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "But my father does." For the first time, Bailey saw something real in Porter Davenport. A desperate son, not just a ruthless businessman. She let out a slow breath. "I'll think about it." As she walked away, Porter watched her go, hoping, for the first time in a long time, that someone would give him a second chance. Bailey returned to her table after the unexpected encounter with Porter, her face thoughtful. Her co-workers, having observed the exchange from a distance, wasted no time in asking questions. "So what did the almighty Porter Davenport want now?" asked Jasmine, one of Bailey's closest colleagues. Bailey sighed, swirling the last of her drink in her glass before setting it down. "He wants me to come back." The table went silent for a moment before David, a fellow nurse, scoffed. "You're joking, right? After what he put everyone through?" Bailey shook her head. "He says he needs help. Apparently he can't find anyone willing to work with him." Jasmine leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And you believe him? A man like that doesn't just change overnight. He's a businessman, Bailey. He knows how to negotiate to get what he wants." Bailey let out a small laugh. "I know. That's why I told him I'd think about it." Her co-workers exchanged glances, some nodding in understanding, others still skeptical. Mark, one of the senior nurses, finally spoke. "Just be careful. Men like Porter Davenport don't ask for help unless there's something in it for them." Bailey nodded, appreciating their concern. "Trust me, I'm not jumping into anything." After that night, she didn't give Porter much thought. She loved where she was working now. and there were plenty of patients who needed just as much attention as Nile Davenport. But fate wasn't done with her yet. A week later, Bailey was unexpectedly called to the administration office. She frowned as she approached the door, wondering what this could be about. When she walked in, her breath hitched for just a second. There, standing beside Mrs. Maples, the hospital administrator, was Porter Davenport. Bailey's expression hardened as she took a seat across from them. She knew this wasn't just a routine meeting. Mrs. Maples folded her hands on the desk and spoke first. "Bailey, we know this is an unusual request, but we'd like you to consider returning to Nile Davenport's care." Bailey's eyes flickered to Porter, who sat silently, looking uncharacteristically patient. Mrs. Maples continued, "Mr. Davenport has agreed not to overstep anymore." Bailey let out a humorless laugh and looked between the two. "That doesn't erase the fact that he made life miserable for everyone. That he tried to have me fired because he wanted to play God with people's livelihoods." Porter was taken aback by her bluntness, but instead of arguing, he nodded. "You're right." His voice was quieter, almost subdued. "I was wrong, and I apologize. Again." Bailey studied him. This was different. He wasn't the arrogant, commanding man who had lashed out at her a month ago. Porter took a deep breath before adding, "I'm willing to make up for my behavior in whatever way the hospital deems proper. I know I damaged relationships here, and I don't want that to continue." Bailey remained skeptical. "And what happens if I return? There's no guarantee you won't decide to have me fired again just because you don't like the way things are going." Porter paused, thinking. Then, after a moment, he said, "What if I hire you as my father's private nurse, separate from the hospital? That way, if we have any problems again, it won't affect your employment here." Bailey hesitated, looking down and shaking her head. She wasn't sure. Porter, sensing her reluctance, leaned forward slightly. "I'll pay whatever you're asking." Bailey lifted her gaze, looking at him long and hard. Then she spoke softly but firmly. "It's not about the money, Mr. Davenport. It's about me going home at night without feeling stressed or dreading coming back to work because of the belittling, because my qualifications are constantly questioned, because I'm not even respected as a human being." Porter's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He knew she was right. Bailey shook her head. "I don't know if you're capable of letting the medical staff do their jobs without constantly interfering with your own medical opinions." Porter exhaled sharply and nodded. "You're right. Again?" He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face before looking at her seriously. "I will apologize to the entire staff and promise to stop getting in the way. I know I have no right to tell medical professionals how to do their jobs. I was desperate, and I let my fear turn into control." His voice softened, the weight of the situation evident. "I'm here for my father. He needs you. And honestly, so do I." Bailey's brows furrowed slightly, but Porter continued before she could respond. "I was told you're the best RN, not just because of your medical expertise, but because you add a human touch that helps patients recover faster. That's something money can't buy." Bailey's heart clenched slightly at his words. She wasn't sure if this was another calculated move or a genuine plea. But for the first time, she saw something raw in Porter Davenport. Something real. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I'll think about it." Porter gave a slow nod, as if he knew that was the best answer he was going to get. And with that, Bailey walked out, leaving him wondering if she would ever walk back in. Bailey was exhausted. She had just finished a grueling double shift, and all she wanted was to get home, take a long shower, and collapse into bed. But as she stepped out of the hospital, she spotted Porter Davenport leaning against his sleek black car, waiting for her. She groaned internally. "Please. Not tonight. I just want to get sun sleep." Porter, however, greeted her in a softer tone than usual. "Bailey." His voice lacked its usual authority, replaced instead with something almost patient. "Let me give you a ride home." Bailey sighed, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. "I'm more than capable of getting home by myself, Mr. Davenport." Before Porter could respond, fate intervened. The skies, which had been threatening rain all day, finally opened up. A torrential downpour came without warning, drenching the pavement within seconds. Bailey barely had time to react before she was soaked. She exhaled sharply, leaning against the hospital's brick wall in frustration. Porter, completely unfazed by the rain, took a step closer. "I have a car waiting here, Bailey. Let me take you home." His tone wasn't demanding. It was almost pleading. Bailey wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to leave her alone, but she was too drained to fight. With a heavy sigh, she muttered, "Fine." Without another word, Porter opened the passenger door for her, and she slid into the warm, luxurious interior. By the time they reached her home, the storm had worsened. Sheets of rain hammered against the windshield, making it nearly impossible to see outside. The car wipers worked furiously, but it was clear that neither of them was going anywhere for a while. Bailey leaned back against the seat, rubbing her temples. She could feel Porter watching her, but he didn't speak at first. After a long silence, he finally asked, "How was your day?" Bailey blinked in surprise, turning her head slightly to look at him. "Small talk? From Porter Davenport?" She shrugged. "Exhausting. But it's part of the job." He nodded as if he understood, then hesitated before asking, "Have you considered my request?" Bailey sighed, looking straight ahead. "No, but I'll have an answer by the end of the week." Porter nodded, seemingly accepting that response. Then, to her complete shock, he asked, "Would you have dinner with me?" Bailey's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. "What?" Porter met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Dinner. Just us. No business talk, no hospital talk." Bailey was too stunned to respond at first. Then she shook her head, letting out a tired chuckle. "Porter, I appreciate the ride, but I need to get inside." She grabbed the handle, but before stepping out, she turned back to him. "I'll contact you later this week with an answer." Without waiting for his response, she slipped out of the car and into her building, leaving Porter Davenport sitting in the storm, wondering why her rejection unsettled him more than he expected. After relentless persistence from Porter, the hospital administration finally convinced Bailey to return, on her terms. She agreed to a 2-week trial to see if Porter would keep his word. She made it clear that if he overstepped or made the work environment unbearable again, she wouldn't hesitate to leave. To her surprise, he actually kept his promise. Porter was still his usual demanding self when it came to his father's care, but he no longer berated the staff. He asked for updates without hostility and showed something Bailey hadn't expected: patience. After the 2-week trial, Bailey agreed to stay longer but left herself an open exit. "I'll stay," she told Mrs. Maples, "but if things go south, I walk away, no questions asked." Porter had simply nodded. "Fair enough." As weeks passed, Porter found himself drawn to the way Bailey cared for his father. She wasn't just checking vitals and administering medication, she was engaging with Nile in ways no one else did. One evening, Porter arrived unannounced and found Bailey reading aloud from one of Nile's favorite books. Another time, she was telling him about her childhood, her voice filled with warmth as she spoke about summers spent with her grandmother in the countryside. Then, one late night, Porter saw something that shook him to his core. Bailey was sitting by his father's bedside, her hands gently holding Nile's. Her head was bowed, whispering a prayer. Porter stood frozen in the doorway, watching as she murmured words he couldn't quite hear. He didn't know what she was saying, but the sincerity in her voice, the sheer faith she had in his father's recovery, was something he had never seen before. For the first time, Porter truly understood why Bailey was different, why she was special. 3 months passed, and still Nile lay silent. Bailey continued her care with the same dedication as the first day, never wavering. Then, one afternoon, it happened. Bailey had just finished adjusting Nile's blankets when she noticed his fingers twitch. At first, she thought she imagined it. But then, a slight movement of his arm. Her heart pounded as she pressed the call button. Nurses rushed in. Porter arrived moments later, breathless. "Where is he?" Porter asked, nearly running into the room. Bailey stepped aside, allowing him to see for himself. Nile's eyes were open, He wasn't speaking, wasn't fully aware, but he was awake. Porter stood there, stunned. His father, the man who had been unresponsive for months, was staring up at the ceiling, blinking slowly, alive in a way he hadn't been in months. Overwhelmed with emotion, Porter turned to Bailey and hugged her. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated. He just reacted. His arms wrapped tightly around her, holding on as if she had just saved his entire world. "Thank you," he whispered, over and over. "Thank you, thank you." Bailey, caught off guard, hesitated before slowly returning the embrace. For the first time, Porter Davenport wasn't a ruthless businessman or a demanding son. He was just a man relieved beyond words. While Nile continued his recovery, Porter made his father's hospital room his temporary office. He set up his laptop on the small table near the window, taking calls, handling business, and overseeing Davenport Global from the sterile white walls of Northern General. But Nile noticed something. His son, the same man who could command boardrooms and shut down multi-million-dollar deals without hesitation, was different here. When speaking on the phone with his executives, Porter's voice was sharp and authoritative. But the moment Bailey entered the room, his tone softened, less rigid, more composed. Nile had built an empire by reading people, and what he saw now was clear as day. One afternoon, while Porter sat by his bedside reviewing reports, Nile finally spoke up. "What's going on between you and Bailey?" Porter glanced up, startled. "What?" Nile raised a tired but amused eyebrow. "My son. I may have been unconscious for months, but I'm not blind." Porter sighed, shaking his head. "There's nothing going on, Dad." Nile smirked, unconvinced. "So, you just get tongue-tied every time she walks in? Your voice drops like you're a schoolboy with a crush. That can't be nothing." Porter ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair. "It's complicated." Nile chuckled, shifting in bed. "Son, life is complicated. Doesn't mean you avoid it." Porter hesitated before finally admitting, "She barely tolerates me, Dad. You don't know how awful I was when you first got here. I lost control of everything after the accident. I lashed out, made her life hell. I even tried to have her fired." Nile's brow furrowed. "I see. She didn't deserve that. But even after I drove her away, I had to get her back. She's the best nurse you could have. She's the reason you're still here." Porter's voice was quiet, filled with something Nile hadn't heard in years, genuine remorse. Nile exhaled slowly. "So, you owe her. That's what this is?" Porter shook his head. "It's more than that. The way she spent time with you, reading to you, talking to you, even when you were unresponsive." Porter's expression softened. "No one else did that. Not even me." Nile narrowed his eyes. "I see how you look at her," Porter scoffed. "Doesn't matter. I don't stand a chance. She's a force of nature, Dad, and she doesn't forgive easily." "Maybe," Nile mused, "but that doesn't mean she's incapable of it." The next day, Nile got his chance to hear Bailey's side. Bailey had just finished adjusting his IV when he cleared his throat. "Bailey, can I ask you something?" Nile's voice was still rough from disuse, but it held its usual curiosity. She smiled politely. "Of course. What do you think of my son?" Bailey froze slightly before composing herself. "In what way?" Nile gave her a knowing look. "Would you ever consider getting dinner with him one day?" Bailey laughed, shaking her head. "That's sweet, but your son and I can barely be in the same room for 10 minutes. Nile grinned. "That's because he thinks you hate him." Bailey grew quiet, folding her arms. "I don't hate him." Nile observed her carefully. "Then what is it?" She sighed, her voice lowering. "He hurt me, with his words, his behavior, so I don't trust him." Nile nodded slowly. "That's fair." Bailey glanced at him, surprised. She had expected defensiveness, not understanding. Nile gave her a small, tired smile. "I've known my son his whole life. He's a brilliant businessman. But when it comes to people, emotions, he's always been a little lost. He's used to controlling everything around him, and when he couldn't control what happened to me, he unraveled." Bailey considered his words but remained cautious. "That still doesn't excuse how he treated people." "No, it doesn't," Nile agreed. "But it explains it." Bailey looked down, thoughtful. She wasn't sure what to make of all this. "I'm not asking you to forgive him overnight," Nile continued. but don't write him off completely." Bailey exhaled and gave him a small nod. She didn't know if she could ever trust Porter Davenport again, but for the first time, she was willing to reconsider. Nile wasn't a man who left things to chance, especially not when it came to matters of business, family, or in this case, his son's future. He had been watching the tension between Bailey and Porter for weeks, and while Bailey was stubborn, Nile knew his son well enough to see the change in him. If Porter was going to have any chance at earning Bailey's trust, he needed a push. So, Nile made a decision. One afternoon, while Porter was buried in paperwork at his makeshift hospital office, Bailey walked in to check his father's vitals. Nile looked up and smiled. "Ah, Bailey, perfect timing," Nile said, his voice light but purposeful. Bailey raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" "Yes," Nile said, then turned to Porter, who barely looked up from his laptop. "My son is taking you out for dinner." Bailey folded her arms. "Are you on any new pain meds, Mr. Davenport?" Nile chuckled. "No, but you two are going out to dinner." Porter finally looked up, completely thrown. "Excuse me?" Nile nodded, pleased with himself. "Porter will be taking you out as a thank you for everything you've done." Bailey shook her head instantly. "That's not necessary. I was just doing my job." Nile scoffed. "Oh, please. According to Porter, you went beyond your duties. You prayed for me, read to me, sat by my side when no one else did." He gestured toward Porter. "The least he can do is buy you dinner." Bailey gave Porter a skeptical glance. "I think that would go against hospital policies." Nile waved a hand dismissively. "I already spoke to Mrs. Maples. It's fine. Porter is not the patient, and last I checked, there's no rule against a CEO taking someone to dinner." Porter leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Father, she doesn't like me." Bailey didn't even hesitate. "No, I don't trust you." Porter muttered under his breath. "That's worse." Nile only smiled. "Well, this is an opportunity for my son to show you the other side of him." Bailey glanced between the two men, feeling cornered. She knew Nile wouldn't let this go easily, and from the way Porter was rubbing his temples, he wasn't thrilled about it either. "I'll think about it," she said, hoping that would be enough to satisfy Nile for the moment, but it wasn't. For the next 3 days, Nile didn't stop harassing her. Every time she entered the room, he'd throw in a casual, "So have you picked a restaurant yet, Porter? He could get you a reservation anywhere." By the 4th day, Bailey sighed in defeat. "Fine," she muttered. "One dinner." Nile grinned victoriously. "Wonderful. I'll make the reservation." Bailey's eyes narrowed. "No, I picked the place." Porter just shook his head, not sure if he was winning or losing her sloth. When the evening of the dinner arrived, Porter didn't take any chances. Instead of making her drive herself, he sent a car for Bailey. It wasn't about trying to impress her, well, maybe a little, but mostly, he wanted her to feel comfortable and respected. Bailey had chosen her favorite Italian restaurant, Vincenzo's, a cozy, family-owned spot tucked away in the heart of the city. It wasn't fancy, but it had the best homemade pasta and garlic bread she had ever tasted. At least if the company is bad, the food will be good, she reasoned. When Bailey arrived, Porter was already waiting at the table, dressed sharply in a dark button-down and tailored slacks. The restaurant was warm, candle-lit, filled with the rich aroma of basil, tomato sauce, and fresh-baked bread. Bailey sat down, smoothing out her dress. The first 20 minutes were painfully awkward. Small talk felt forced. They spoke about Nile's progress, the hospital, and the weather, as if they were co-workers forced to socialize. Then, somewhere between the bruschetta appetizer and their main courses, things shifted. It happened when Porter mentioned his mother. "She used to make homemade pasta on Sundays," he admitted, said it was the one thing money couldn't replace, real food made with love. Bailey smiled, surprised. "My grandmother used to say the same thing. Sundays were for family meals." They started talking about their childhoods, their favorite comfort foods, and the traditions that made them who they were. Porter spoke about his mother's garden, how she insisted he learn to cook a few meals even though he hated it at the time. Bailey shared how her grandmother used to let her roll out the dough, even when she made a mess. The conversation flowed naturally after that. They laughed when Bailey told a story about nearly burning her kitchen down trying to make homemade pizza. Porter teased her about it, but admitted he had once completely ruined a steak because he thought searing meant cooking it on high heat the whole time. By the time dinner ended, Bailey had to admit it wasn't terrible. Porter insisted on walking Bailey to her door when they arrived at her apartment. The night was cool and peaceful. She turned to face him. "Well, I have to say, this wasn't as painful as I thought it would be." Porter smirked. "I'll take that as a win." There was a brief pause before Porter cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Would you be open to doing this again?" Bailey raised an eyebrow. "A date?" Porter hesitated before nodding. "Yes. A date." She crossed her arms, studying him. "Why me?" He looked at her, serious now. "Because you're different. You challenge me. You don't care about my money or my name. And for once, I'd like to spend time with someone who sees me as just Porter." Bailey considered him for a long moment, then smirked slightly. "I'll think about it." And with that, she disappeared inside, leaving Porter standing in the moonlight, hoping for a second chance. Bailey felt strange as she settled into bed that night. She had walked away from Porter Davenport's request for another date, thinking she could brush it off, but now her mind wouldn't let it go. Why me? They were nothing alike. He was a billionaire's heir, a man used to power and control. She was a nurse from a modest background who had built her career on compassion, not connections. What does he even see in me? She told herself that Porter was just grateful, that's all. He wasn't interested in her. Not really. He was overwhelmed by his father's recovery, and in time, those emotions would fade. Still, why did it bother her so much? The next morning, Bailey walked into Nile's room, expecting a normal check-in. What she wasn't expecting was for him to bring up the dinner. "I heard the evening went well," Nile said casually as she adjusted his blankets. Bailey smirked. "Who told you that?" "I have my sources," Nile replied, his eyes twinkling. "So what do you think about my son now?" Bailey laughed, shaking her head. "He's okay, I guess." Nile raised an eyebrow. "Just okay?" Bailey shrugged. "I still don't know him well enough to give a sound judgment." Nile nodded, clearly amused. "Fair enough." He waited a moment before adding, "So, when's the next date?" Bailey whipped her head around to look at him. "Excuse me?" Nile chuckled. "You heard me." Bailey rolled her eyes. "I haven't decided yet." "Well, what's stopping you?" Nile asked, studying her. She sighed, folding her arms. "Why are you so invested in this?" Nile smiled knowingly. "Because I've known my son his whole life, and I've never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you." Bailey felt heat rise to her cheeks but quickly shook it off. "We have nothing in common." "That's what makes it interesting," Nile countered. Bailey huffed. "I'm sure there's some woman in your inner circle just waiting to snatch Porter up for herself. Someone from his world." Nile nodded. "Oh, there are plenty. Beautiful, well-bred, ambitious women who would love to be the next Mrs. Davenport." Bailey smirked. "Exactly. But," Nile continued, "Porter has never shown interest in any of them. Not for years." Bailey froze slightly, caught off guard. Nile leaned back against his pillows. "He's a man who could have any woman in his social circle, yet the one who's caught his attention is you, Bailey Cannon. And that says something." Bailey shook her head, unconvinced. "He's just grateful. What he's feeling will pass as soon as you go home." Nile smiled but said nothing, because he knew something Bailey didn't. Porter Davenport was a man who didn't waste his time on things that weren't important to him. And Bailey Cannon? She was becoming very important. After days of persistent nudging from Nile and some deep reflection, Bailey finally agreed to go on a second date with Porter. This time, he insisted on choosing the location. Bailey, half expecting some high-end, exclusive venue, was genuinely surprised when Porter's car pulled up to a grand estate on the outskirts of town, the Davenport family home. She stepped out, taking in the breathtaking colonial-style mansion with its ivy-covered brick walls, wrap-around porch, and massive oak trees that lined the driveway. But what caught her attention wasn't the grandeur, it was the fact that the place felt lived in. She had assumed Porter's house would be cold, modern, and lifeless, but this was a home. Porter watched her reaction closely as he held the front door open for her. "You're surprised?" Bailey nodded as she stepped inside, immediately noticing the warmth of the place. Family pictures along the hallway. An old grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the faint scent of wood polish and aged books. "I expected something more." "I don't know. Like a showroom," she admitted, glancing around. Porter smirked. "Yeah, most people do." He led her into the sitting room, where a roaring fireplace cast a golden glow over the room. Shelves lined with books, antique furniture, and a cozy, slightly worn-in couch made it clear that this place held memories. Bailey turned to him. "So why here?" Porter exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he sat down. "Because this is the only place that ever truly felt like home." He gestured for her to sit, and when she did, his expression turned uncharacteristically soft. "My mother lived here since she was a young child," he explained. "She was the one who kept me grounded. She had this way of making me feel like I wasn't just some heir to a company, but an actual person." Bailey listened, intrigued. "When she passed, everything changed. My dad, he became bitter. He turned everything into a transaction, a business deal. I guess in a way, I followed in his footsteps." He let out a small chuckle. "And look where that got me." Bailey tilted her head slightly. "And now?" Porter met her gaze. "Now you made me remember where I came from." Bailey blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" Porter nodded. "My mother never let my father walk all over her. She challenged him, held him accountable. I always admired that about her. And now, I realize, I've always wanted someone like that in my life." Bailey's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "So, you think I'm that person?" Porter held her gaze. "I'm not sure, but I'd like the opportunity to find out." Bailey sat back, taking a slow breath. "I don't know how to respond to that." Porter chuckled, leaning his elbows on his knees. "Yeah, that was a huge confession." Bailey couldn't help but laugh softly. "You think?" Porter sat up straight. "Look, I know I've been a terrible person in the past. I pushed people away. I let my fear turn into control. And I treated you, along with a lot of others, unfairly. But if there's one thing I learned through all this, it's that I don't want to wake up one day and realize I let something important slip away just because I was too afraid to change." Bailey studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who was trying, really trying. She sighed, a small smile playing at her lips. "Let's take time to get to know each other first. Maybe in a couple of weeks. I'll be able to tell you if you're right." Porter grinned, nodding. "I can live with that." But inside, he knew he wasn't going to take any chances. That night, Porter made a decision. He started cutting back on work responsibilities. He handed off projects, delegated more to his executives, and for the first time in years, he actually stepped away from his empire. Because for once, business wasn't his priority. Bailey Cannon was. After months of recovery, Nile was finally released from the hospital. With his health still delicate, Bailey became his full-time nurse at the Davenport estate, ensuring he received proper care in the comfort of his own home. She was reluctant at first, unsure if she wanted to entangle herself any deeper in the world of the Davenports. Nile insisted. "You've already put up with me this long," he had joked. "What's a little longer?" And truthfully, Bailey didn't mind. She had grown fond of Nile, his wisdom, and even his mischievous matchmaking ways. As for Porter, now that he had more free time, he made it his mission to win over Bailey's heart. He showed up during her breaks, engaged her in meaningful conversations, and proved to her that his interest wasn't fleeting. Little by little, her walls came down. And when she finally allowed herself to admit it, she had fallen for him. An introduction to their world. Once Nile was settled at home, Porter decided to throw an intimate, welcome home party in his honor. It was a private yet elegant affair, attended by close friends, influential business partners, and members of high society. But more than anything, It was an opportunity for Nile and Porter to officially introduce Bailey to their world. Bailey, dressed in a classic navy blue evening dress, held her own despite the many judgmental stares. Some people dismissed her immediately, whispering behind their champagne glasses. A nurse dating Porter Davenport? She was clearly not one of them. But before she could even be bothered by it, Nile shut it down. At the center of the room, standing tall with his drink in hand, he made his stance clear. "For those of you who have questions about my son's relationship," he announced, scanning the room, "let me make one thing perfectly clear. Bailey Cannon is family. And anyone who has a problem with that, well, you can see yourselves out." The murmurs ceased, and those who had dismissed Bailey suddenly changed their tune. Porter, standing beside Bailey, squeezed her hand gently. She wasn't alone in this. She was one of them now, shutting down the past. But of course, no event was complete without a little drama. Porter's ex-girlfriend, Megan St. James, made sure of that. She was the perfect picture of wealth and privilege, flawlessly styled, poised, and completely self-assured. She had once thought she'd be the future Mrs. Davenport, and the idea that Porter had moved on wasn't sitting well with her. Spotting Porter and Bailey in a private conversation, Megan slinked her way over, resting a perfectly manicured hand on Porter's arm. "Porter," she purred, her voice dripping with old familiarity. "You look good." Bailey raised an eyebrow, immediately sensing the play. Porter stepped back slightly, but before he could speak, Bailey did. With a sweet but firm smile, she looked Megan dead in the eye. "You're wasting your time, sweetheart," Bailey said coolly. "Porter is mine. You had your chance and you failed. If you're looking for someone else's arm to hang on to, you're going to have to find another man that's not already taken." Megan's face twisted, clearly caught off guard. Porter, however, was beyond impressed. His lips curled into a smirk, watching as Megan huffed and stormed off. Turning back to Bailey, he shook his head. "That was incredible." Bailey shrugged. "I don't share. Beside, these people don't intimidate me." Porter chuckled, looking at her as if he had just found the one thing he never knew he needed. In that moment, he knew Bailey Cannon would make the perfect wife. 6 months later, it was Bailey and Porter's wedding day, a day that once seemed impossible, yet here they were, standing on the cusp of forever. The ceremony was held at the Davenport estate, where so much of their journey had unfolded. The sprawling gardens were transformed into a breathtaking scene. White roses lined the aisle. Golden chandeliers hung from grand oak trees, and soft music filled the air. Seated in the front row, Nile watched with pride as the woman who had once been just his nurse became part of his family. His son had found someone who wouldn't just love him, but challenge him, steady him, and bring out the best in him. When Bailey walked down the aisle, radiant in a fitted lace gown, Nile felt a lump in his throat. He leaned over to the guest beside him and murmured, "She's a force, that one." For the first time in his life, Porter Davenport was nervous. Not because he was unsure, but because he had never wanted something more. As Bailey stepped toward him, his breath caught. She was stunning, strong, everything he never knew he needed. When she reached him, he whispered, "You take my breath away." Bailey smirked slightly. Bailey never thought she'd fall for a man like Porter Davenport, but looking at him now, his love and devotion written all over his face, she had no doubts. As they exchanged vows, she knew they were equals, partners, a love worth fighting for. And when Porter kissed his bride, the world faded, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. As the sun set over the Davenport estate, the reception was in full swing. Laughter and music filled the air, guests clinking glasses, and the glow of string lights casting a warm, golden hue over the celebration. Porter and Bailey shared their first dance beneath the stars, swaying to a melody that seemed written just for them. As he held her close, Porter whispered in her ear, "I meant what I said before. I want forever with you." Bailey smiled against his shoulder, gripping his hand tighter. "Forever, huh?" He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes with absolute certainty. "Yeah, forever." At a table nearby, Nile watched them with a full heart. He had spent years building his empire, thinking that was his legacy. But watching his son now, truly happy, truly whole, he realized this moment was worth more than all the money in the world. As the night continued, Porter grabbed a glass, tapping a spoon against it to get everyone's attention. "To my wife," he said, voice steady but filled with emotion. "You walked into my life when I least deserved you. You challenged me, humbled me, and showed me what it means to truly love. I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of that love." Bailey's eyes shimmered, and when he reached for her hand, she squeezed it, knowing without a doubt this was the life she wanted. With Nile's blessing, the warmth of their friends, and a love that neither of them expected, Bailey and Porter's forever had just begun. The end. Hope you enjoyed this story by Green Tea Tales. Show your support by like, share, and subscribe.